Chapter 10, Dobrushka, the Red Kabbala, and the Jacobins. The question that should be asked is, was there any rational basis for the men of the Illuminati to behave as they did and to set into motion revolutions, upheavals, and conspiracies? Did they not realize that they were performing evil? And where, pray tell, did they receive an inspiration for carrying out their hideous tasks without falling apart by confrontation with their own consciences? Especially since these men as a group were exceptionally wealthy and of acute intellect and far above the average intelligence of the common criminal. Furthermore, was there anything in their philosophy or makeup that led them to lead a double type of life, indeed a schizophrenic existence? It is the writer's contention that throughout history, the communist idea has always existed. Indeed, it even preceded Plato's Republic, regarded as the supreme blueprint for a communist society. The question was whether, with the political fortunes of the hour, the opportunity would lend itself for kindred spirits not only to conspire towards these goals, but to effectuate their plan into action. Certainly, this was the case when the Hellenists fought the Hasmoneans and were defeated by the Maccabees. But in analyzing the conflict, Judah Maccabee was not just fighting with his troops against a foreign government, but was fighting subversion in his own country, initiated by the super-rich. The Tobiad family, for example, after acquiring fantastic fortunes, decided to turn their attention to a field in which they had previously little interest, that of politics. Having done that, they were determined to bring a new order into the land of Israel. Again, we find that Mazdak, 6th century, arose in Persia and carried out a fight to overthrow artisans and entrepreneurs in his day, wishing to bring a cooperative society and a new order. But the Persians defeated him and were incidentally led by the Jewish community, Prince Marzutra, who organized middle class and Persian society and checked Mazdak and his mobs. Before the advent of the Illuminati, there were tremendous upheavals taking place of a political and religious nature. The Jesuits had been dethroned and were not restored to their former position within the church until 1814, called the Restoration. What was known as the suppression of the Jesuits began in 1773, which is 3 years before Weishaupt founded the Illuminati. The Jesuits were accused of building a power base for themselves within the Catholic Church, especially since royal confessors were usually Jesuits. The Jesuits were also constantly involved with infighting within the church, such as with the Dominican and Franciscan orders. The scientific community and the Enlighteners did not like the Jesuits, and furthermore, there was extreme friction developing between the Jesuits and the academic community, especially with the Sorbonne in Paris. In 1759, the order had been banished from Portugal. It was in 1769 that Clement XIV became Pope, and he expressed the view that, quote, sometimes we must cut down the mast to have a ship, end quote. On July 21, 1773, 3 years before the founding of the Illuminati, he issued his Brief of Suppression. Then, strangely enough, he said, for the sake of peace and because the society can no longer attain the aims for which it was founded, and on secret grounds which we enclose in our heart, we suppress the said society. No one to this very day knows exactly what the secret grounds were, but St. Alphonsus Liguori declared that it was due to a, quote, plot of Jansenists and infidels, or in other words, Illuminati types and mystical radicals that had infiltrated and dominated the Jesuits. In the case of the Jewish religion, the community had been exposed to a very dangerous man, one Jacob Frank, 1726 to 1791. Now, we've talked about him before, and the next chapter is actually dedicated. It is entitled Jacob Frank. Frank's story begins with Shabbatai Zvi, 1626 to 1676. Shabbatai Zvi claimed that he was the Messiah and that he would deliver the Jews from their oppressors and return them to their homeland. In his day, over 1 million Jews from every walk of life proclaimed him and hailed him as their deliverer. As time went on, Shabbatai became more militant in his messianic pronouncements, and as the quote-unquote Messiah, he started to proclaim that certain aspects of Jewish law are no longer binding. He also began to speak out against the authority of the Talmud. As his renunciation of certain aspects of Judaism became more pronounced, so did he begin to lose some of his his initial faithful followers. Shabbatai married a prostitute named Sarah, who had been an orphan of the Polish excesses of the Chmielnicki massacres that were, part of the 17th century Cossack rebellion against the Polish middle class. This marriage was consummated to conform to a legend that the Messiah would marry an unchaste bride. Shabbatai was born in Turkey, but he moved to the Holy Land where he gained a tremendous following and announced that he would march against Constantinople to oppose the Sultan. About this time, he was officially excommunicated by the rabbis of his generation. The Sultan did not wish to make a martyr of Shabbatai, but threw him into prison. This only strengthened the movement and hardened his followers. At this point, the Sultan gave Shabbatai a choice between death or conversion to become a Muslim and freedom. Shabbatai chose conversion and freedom. Had he not, he probably would have gone down in Jewish history as a sainted martyr with a tremendous following. At the time of his conversion, thousands of his followers became disillusioned and abandoned the movement. However, there were still some stubborn followers who believed in him and, of course, rationalized their following him by inventing some type of rationale. Hence, the movement gave rise to a special Sabbatean sect in Turkey known as the Donmeh. The order maintained that the Messiah would have to sin before he could bring redemption, and this provided a rationale for believing in a Jewish Messiah who was of Islam. Many years after Shabbatai Zvi's death, the Donmeh continued to exist and to grow. Jacob Frank encountered the Donmeh while he was a traveling salesman in Turkey. He refined the concept of the Messiah sinning by urging members of the movement to sin, reasoning that if salvation could be gotten through purity, it could also be achieved through sin. Gershom Scholem, the Great Kabbala authority, has elaborated on this theme in such writings as his Hebrew Mitzvah ha-ba'avera, which was translated into an article that appeared in Commentary in 1971 entitled The Holiness of Sin, as well as a chapter in his Messianic Idea in Judaism entitled Redemption Through Sin. One of the ways that the Frankists indulged in their sin was to engage in sexual orgies. The Donmeh in Turkey officially converted to Islam in 1683, and the Frankists in Europe to Catholicism in 1759. However, their conversion to these religions was for the purpose of imitating the Sabbatean role models, as well as for subverting and destroying these faiths. As for the danger of the Frankist movement and its reckless revolutionary policies, Gershom Scholem gives more than ample testimony, as we shall quote liberally from his writings. He says of the Frankist sect, quote, "Here then we have all the prerequisites for the sectarian disposition, for the sect serves the Illuminati as both a rallying point for their own kind and a refuge from the incomprehension of the carnal and unenlightened masses. The sectarians regard themselves as the vanguard of the new world." And the idea was that the King Messiah was to give a new Torah and that the commandments of the law, or mitzvot, were to be abrogated in Messianic times. So abrogated means done away with or forgotten about. Even those visionaries who dreamt through the ages of a new word of God in a redeemed world did not, in fact, particularly connect this idea with the activities of the Messiah himself. And it was not until it was seized upon by the new Maronic doctrine that its latent explosive power was revealed. End quote. Therefore, Scholem says of Frank that he will always be remembered as one of the most frightening phenomena in the whole of Jewish history, a religious leader who was a corrupt individual. Scholem summarizes the 5 distinguishing beliefs of radical Sabbationism, which are essentially beliefs that 1, the apostasy of the Messiah is a necessity, that 2, the real Torah is not the real Torah and must be violated by conforming to another superior alien mystical Torah called the Torah of Absolute or aristocracy. So what does that remind you of, like the First National Church of the federal government? Okay, also essential beliefs of Sabbationism include number 3, first cause and the God of Israel are not the same, the former being the God of rational philosophers and the latter the God of religion. Number 4, that Godhead takes human form, which allowed for leaders of the sect to be incarnated into that Godhead, from Shabbatai Zvi through to Frank and others. And number 5, that believer, quote-unquote believer, must not appear to be as he really is. So the last belief justified its followers' pursuit of the double life that they really led. And one could appear to be a religious Jew on the outside, and in reality, they would be a Frankist. For though the Donmehs officially converted to Islam and the Frankists to Catholicism, the great majority of Frankists who outwardly appeared to embrace Judaism integrated themselves into the Jewish community. Despite the fact that they were all outwardly religious, they still cherished as their goal, quote, the annihilation of every religion and positive system of belief, end quote. And they dreamed of, quote, of a general revolution that would sweep away the past in a single stroke so that the world might be rebuilt, end quote. Of the revolutionary philosophy of the Frankists and its mystical symbolism, Gershom Scholem writes elsewhere in his Kabbala and its symbolism that this life, however, is not the harmonious life of all things in bond with God, a world ordered by divine law and submissive to his authority, but something very different, utterly free, fettered by no law or authority. This life never ceases to produce forms and to destroy that which it has produced. It is the anarchic promiscuity of all living things. Into this bubbling cauldron, this continuum of destruction, the mystic plunges. To him, it is the ultimate human experience. For Frank, anarchic destruction represented all the Luciferian radiance, all the positive tones and overtones of the word life. The nihilistic mystic descends into the abyss in which the freedom of living things is born. He passes through the embodiments and forms that come his way, committing himself to none, and not content with rejecting and abrogating all values and laws, he tramples them underfoot and desecrates them in order to attain the elixir of life. In this radical interpretation of a symbol, the life-giving element of mystical experience was combined with its potential destructiveness. It goes without saying that from the standpoint of the community and its institutions, such mysticism should have been regarded as demonic possession. And it is indicative of one of the enormous tensions that through the history of Judaism, that the most destructive of all visions should have been formulated in its most unrestrained form by one who rebelled against the Jewish law and broke away from Judaism. And that was a quote by Gershom Scholem. Jacob Frank preached his religious myth of nihilism in more than 2,000 dogmatic sayings. One of the Frankist cult's publications that has come into our possession is a book entitled Book of the Words of the Lord, which Scholem characterizes as a mixture of primitive savagery and putrescent morals. The Frankists had a way of turning around old homilies and saying that they were common among the people, twisting them into their nihilistic Torah of aristocracy. For example, religious Jews at the beginning of the morning service start their prayers with a series of 13 benedictions in which one thanks God for providing the necessities of life, for clothing the unclothed, etc., etc. Among these benedictions is one that praises God for freeing those in captivity. The Hebrew for this is Matur Asurim. In the Frankist cult, the benediction was pronounced praising God as Matir Asurim, which means permitting the prohibited. Similarly, they twisted around other sayings. They would say, the subversion of the Torah can become its true fulfillment, and great is a sin committed for its own sake. The Talmud states that the Messiah will come only in an age which is completely guilty or completely innocent. And that's according to 98a of the Sanhedrin. From this epigram, the Frankists would state, since we cannot all be saints, let us all be sinners. Scholem goes on to say that this blasphemous benediction, who permits the forbidden, came to be considered by these radicals as the true expression of their feeling to the anarchic religious feelings of these new Jews. All the three great institutional religions had no longer an absolute value. So how did all these revolutionary tendencies fit in with reform, liberalism, and enlightenment? Scholem says that the Frankists and the Donmeh remained in close contact even after their formal apostasy. Most of the followers of Frank who remained Jewish were concentrated in Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, or Romania. Of them, Scholem states, It was the influence of these elements, who had not openly cut themselves off from the rabbinical Judaism, which after the French Revolution became important in fostering the movement towards reform, liberalism, and enlightenment in many Jewish circles. Around 1850, a consciousness of this link between Sabbationism and reform was still alive in some quarters. In circles close to the moderate reform movement, a very remarkable and undoubtedly authentic tradition had it that Aaron Chorin, the first pioneer of Reform Jewry in Hungary, was in his youth a member of the Sabbatian group in Prague. Prosnitz and Hamburg, both in the 18th century centers of Sabbatian propaganda and the scene of bitter struggle between the Orthodox and the heretics or their sympathizers, were among the chief strongholds of the Reform movement in the beginning of the 19th century. The sons of these Frankists in Prague, who in 1800 still pilgrimed to Offenbach near Frankfurt, the seat of Frank's successors, and who educated their children in the spirit of the mystical sect, were among the leaders in 1832 of the first reform organization in Prague. The writings of Jonas Wahi himself, the spiritual leader of these Prague mystics around 1800, already display an astonishing mixture of mysticism and rationalism. Of his extensive writings, an extremely interesting commentary to the Talmudic Agadoth is extant in manuscript, from which it is clear that his particular pantheon had room for Moses Mendelssohn and Immanuel Kant, side by side with Sabbatai Zevi and Isaac Luria. And as late as 1864, his nephew, writing in New York, lengthily praises in his testament his Sabbatian and Frankist ancestors as the standard bearers of the true Jewish faith, i.e., of a deeper spiritual understanding of Judaism. How did the Polish rabbis attempt to eradicate the Frankists? Well, they stated that it was obligatory for every pious Jew to search and expose them. The rabbis had watched Frank's sinister activities but could not muster sufficient proof to excommunicate him. In 1752, he married a Bulgarian Jewish woman named Chana. She was very beautiful, and he utilized her, as was the custom among members of his sect, to ensnare hundreds of men who had licentious affairs with her to build up the strength of his sect. But at one point, public pressure became so great in Turkey that he was forced to embark for Poland in 1755. By this time, Chana had 2 sons, Joseph and Jacob, and a daughter, Eva. However, on the 20th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan of 1756, in the city of Satino, the rabbis formally excommunicated Frank and all of his followers. They prohibited anyone from intermarrying with any member of the sect. The great Rabbi Jacob Emden, 1697 to 1776, wrote in a letter that it was prohibited for anyone to have mercy on them. The excommunication largely came about from an incident in which some illustrious rabbis, who were not too familiar with this sect, were invited to a meeting by members of their congregations, and when they were invited into a larger hall in the city of Laskron to get recruits, the door was locked behind them and a nude woman danced in right in front of their faces. The rabbis then had sufficient evidence and witnesses to the incident. At the meeting, Frank spoke of a revolution against the government, and this led to his arrest by the police, and he was thereafter exiled from Poland. Wherever the Frankists came, they left desolation and despair in the Jewish communities. They instigated public burnings of the Talmud. Thousands of books of the Talmud were burned in the city of Kamenetz on the last day of the Hebrew month Marak Shavan, Sheshavan, in 1757. A chain of Talmud burnings ensued in Lvov, Brody, and Zolkev until the persecutor, Bishop Dembowski, a befriender of Frank, died suddenly on November 9th, 1757. The people saw this as the hand of God. The Frankists enticed women to leave their husbands and to join their orgies. Families were broken up by the hundreds, and this is even more amazing considering the strong family life that characterized the Jews in the small communities in Podylia, Moravia, Poland, Hungary, and Romania at the time. They joined the Christian bigots in accusing the Jews of blood libels, claiming that the Jews murdered Christian children and used their blood for the Passover holiday. For example, in the public disputation with the rabbis in Lvov in 1759, they made a public accusation of blood libel, and Scholem is of the opinion that they did this in a scheme to collaborate with bigoted Catholic clergymen in order to wreak vengeance on their rabbinical persecutors. Scholem cites from the eminent historian Meyer Balaban a conversation which took place in Lvov between Rabbi Chaim Rappaport and the Frankist Elazir Jazirzani, who said, "Chaim, we have given you blood for blood. You meant to make the shedding of our blood lawful, and now you have been given blood for blood." In one case of blood libel in the small shteti, or Jewish village of Vilovich, the Frankists took revenge on the local rabbi of the town by dressing one of their women up as the rabbi's wife. The impersonation was perfect. She appeared before the local priest and said that she saw the rabbi kill a Christian child for Passover. Because of this incident, the rabbi and all the members of his congregation were killed after a very brief trial. The rabbi's wife and his 5 remaining children were tortured into accepting Christianity. In 1759, when the Frankists officially converted to Catholicism, Frank was baptized in the Warsaw Cathedral with no less a personage than Emperor Augustus III as godfather. A year later, he was accused of heresy and he was thrown into the citadel of Częstochowa and was released in 1773 only by the Russian conquest on the eve of the first partition of Poland. The reason why Frank was thrown into prison was because it was discovered that the godhead of the Frankist cult was not the Trinity, but included members of the sect. The author came across a very rare edition of a book entitled Jerusalem, a Treatise of Ecclesiastic Authority in Judaism by Moses Mendelssohn, published in 1838 by M. Samuels. On page 257 of Volume 1 occurs the following note, which is reproduced in its entirety. It reads, "The chiefs of the sect carry about them a badge or a medal by which they make themselves known to one another and to the members. It is of the size of a half-crown piece and coined like the Abraham coin mentioned in the Talmud." On one side of the coin it has this inscription, and on the other side it has this inscription, these letters. So it says evidently the initials of this inscription, but underneath there appear to again be these letters, which the difference of one symbol is a shin, not a sin. Instead of the resh, there is a deleth, so it reads this final bottom inscription here, the 4 chiefs of the sect. So these 4 included Elijah the prophet, who was Redeemer, Sabbatai, who was Messiah, Jonathan Iberschutzer, and this proves how justly he was accused of heresy, and Dobrushka, who was actually Frank. And later he only adopted the name in Germany of Dobrushka, as did his 2 nephews that of the name Frey, under which they resided in Paris, till they were guillotined in the days of terror. So we shall now explain the meaning of the fascinating footnote. According to legend, Abraham minted his own coins containing on one side a Hebrew inscription shown in the footnote, which means an old man, an old lady, a young man, and a virgin. On the opposite side of the coin were the letters, which were Hebrew names and initials for those whom this epigram represented. They were, reading from right to left, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. On the coinage of the Frankists, the lettering similarly appeared, excepting that the letter shin for Sarah, which is Hebrew, is designated by a dot on the left for an S sound, which had the dot of the right designating the SH sound, which stood for Shabbatai. The Resh, which stood for Rebecca, was replaced with the Hebrew letter Dalid, which bears some graphic resemblance to Reish, which stood for Dobrushka. The names on the Frankist coin represented Elijah the prophet, Shabbatai, Rabbi Jonathan Albeschutz, 1690 to 1764, and Jacob Frank in the alias of Dobrushka. The latter 2 names require some further explanation. So Rabbi Jonathan Albeschutz was a Frankist personality who led a double life, which is not surprising. Secretly, he was a Sabbatian, but outwardly he assumed the life of a great rabbinical scholar and decisor. It was the great Gaonic sage Rabbi Jacob Emden, 1697 to 1776, who exposed Iberschutz as a Sabbatian. The basis for the expose began in 1751 after Rabbi Iberschutz had left Metz in France in 1750 for Itona in Germany. Emden based his charges on 5 amulets which had been issued to various individuals in the Metz community. Certified copies of the amulets were transmitted by scribes of the Jewish community and sealed by a royal notary. The amulets showed that Eibeschutz invoked the power of Shabbatai Zvi, and some bitter controversy broke out between Rabbi Emden and Eibeschutz, which split the Jewish community through Europe. The interesting thing about Samuel's note is that Eibeschutz was not just a Sabbatean, but he was an actual participant in the Holy Trinity, or more correctly, quaternary of the Frankists. What comes out of this footnote is that Eibeschutz must have taken the Masa Duma, Isaiah 21:11, the burden of silence which members of the innermost Frankist circles took. Dobrushka is the name that Frank assumed after he left prison in 1773 and resided for 13 years in Brunn in Moravia with his relatives Solomon and Scheindel Dobrushka. Solomon, 1715 to 1774, held both the potash and tobacco monopolies in Moravia. Their children were Frank's nephews. The Encyclopedia Judaica states that Frank's income was a constant source of wonder and speculation, and the matter was never resolved. The encyclopedia further declares that during his sojourn with Dobrushka, Frank spoke of a great deal about general revolution which would overthrow kingdoms, and the Catholic Church in particular. In the Frankist quaternary, we find that the Frankist name Dobrushka takes the place of the Virgin. How then does Frank fit in with this feminine personality? Frank accomplishes the female aspect by giving his wife sexually to members of the sect, and later his daughter Eva, who went to bed with the greatest of all of Europe, such as Joseph II, Emperor of Austria, in 1755. The Frankists sojourned in Austria until Frank crossed the Dniester River on December 3rd, 1755. Frank preached that the Virgin is renewed by going to Edom, which is represented by Christianity, so that revolution comes from Edom. He viewed the religions of the world as portals through which one passes before the redemption. What is not too well known is that 2 years before his and other Frankists' conversion to Catholicism in 1759, Frank converted to Islam. In the Frankists' Godhead, we can find the 4 personalities represented by 1. Aitika Kadisha, 2. Matka Kadisha, 3. Shakina, and 4. the Great Brother. The last may account for the term Big Brother. The first 3 designations are legitimate Kabbalistic terms for mystic manifestations of God's presence. When we examine the personalities as being exemplary of stages of the revolution, Elijah represents the ultimate Messiah, which is reached by starting with Judaism, represented by Jonathan Eibeschutz, going to Islam, represented by Shabbatai Zvi, and the last portal represented by Frank in Christianity. After the revolution comes Big Brother, who rules the earth. When Frank requested his formal conversion to Christianity, he asked that certain conditions be followed so as to enable his converts to appear secretly as Jews. Among the conditions for the conversion were that converts, 1, not be compelled to shave their sideburns, 2, be allowed to wear traditional Jewish garb, 3, have Jewish and Christian names, 4, not be forced to eat unkosher food, and 5, rest on both Saturday and Sunday. Examination of the previously mentioned subversive Temple of Understanding in Washington, D.C. reveals a Frankist type of connotation where there are 6 portals depicting Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Confucianism, and Hinduism. The question may be asked as to why much of the information has escaped wider study. Gershom Scholem attempts to answer this question in his Holiness of Sin, as follows. Secularist historians, on the other hand, have been at pains to de-emphasize the role of Sabbationism for a different reason. Not only did most of the families once associated with the Sabbatian movement in Western and Central Europe continue to remain afterward within the Jewish fold, but many of the descendants, particularly in Austria, rose to positions of importance during the 19th century as prominent intellectuals, great financiers, and men of high political connections. Such persons, needless to say, could scarcely have been expected to approve of attempts to expose their tainted lineage, and in view of their stature in the Jewish community, it is not surprising that their wishes should have been carried out. Furthermore, in an age when the Jewish scholarship itself was considered to be in part an extension of the struggle for political emancipation, the climate for research is so sensitive an area was by no means generally favorable. In consequence, those Jewish scholars who had access to the wealth of Sabbatian documentation and eyewitness reports that were still to be found early in the centuries, they failed to take advantage of the opportunity, which by the time a later generation arrived on the scene, the sources had been destroyed and were no longer available even to anyone who might have desired to make use of them. At the same time, Scholem points out that religious Jews have been reluctant to deal with Sabbatianism because of the subversion of rabbis such as Iver Schultz, which Scholem was described in great detail in his monograph Lecet Margolio. As for M. Samuels's remaining remarks and his footnote concerning Frank's two nephews, Frey, who resided in Paris and were guillotined in the days of the Terror, they were definitely Jacobins, and it is this checking of this passage with the history of the French Revolution that bears out the accuracy of M. Samuel's remarks. Samuels discusses in detail some of Frank's activities while in Offenbach, where he lived a regal lifestyle and maintained a militia. He died in Offenbach on August 10th, 1791, having settled there in 1786. There he gave instructions in chemistry to his military guard. Some of the chemical concoctions ascribed to the Illuminati in Zwack's collection were prepared by Frank for the Illuminati. The Frey brothers, referred to by Samuels, who were guillotined, were actually the children of Scholem and Dobrushka. Of 12 children fathered by Solomon, all were Frankists, and 8 openly converted to Christianity. 6 Dobrushkas were ennobled. Solomon's son, Moses Dobrushka, was an outstanding man of letters. He was born July 12, 1753, and officially converted to Catholicism on December 7, 1773. After his baptism in Prague, his name was changed to Schoenfeld, the name of the ennobled Dobrushka children. In 1782, Moses Dobrushka, now Schoenfeld, founded a Masonic lodge called the Asiatische Brüder, or the Asiatic Brotherhood, which was one of the 4 Illuminati lodges in Vienna. After his uncle's death on August 10, 1791, he was offered the leadership of the Frankist movement, which he refused, because as a revolutionary Jacobin, he exercised far greater power than he could with the Frankists. In 1792, he and his brother Emmanuel, 1765 to 1794, changed their names to Frey, F-R-E-Y. Stanley Loomis's book, Paris and the Terror, Avon, 1964, refers to the Frey brothers, but he writes their name as Frey, F-R-E-I, and describes their trial as Jacobins taking place at the same time with the more famous Danton. Loomis mentions that the Frey brothers were guillotined because of their activities with the East India Corporation, whose company's tea, as you may recall, was dumped into one said harbor for one said Boston Tea Party. The Frey's sister, Leopoldine, married the Jacobin Francois Cabot, 1757 to 1794, who was a former Franciscan monk, and he was noted for having voted for the death of Louis XVI. Cabot joined the Frey brothers at the guillotine on April 5, 1794, he being likewise found to be enmeshed with East India Company intrigues. What is perhaps more interesting is who the big financial investments were behind the Frey brothers. They were Illuminati princes who had financed the East India Company and who had kept Frank in the luxury that he was accustomed to. By 1816, the last of the Frank children, Ava, died, being preceded by her brother Joseph in 1807, and by her other brother, who had changed his name upon conversion to Christianity, to Rochas, R-O-C-H-A-S, in 1813. Diamant says of Eva, she preserved the dues-paying membership of Frankism by combining the scholasticism of the Zohar with the mysteries of her bedroom into a lucrative religion which enabled her to live a grand lifestyle like her father. The Kabbalah had not taught her how to retain her youth, however, and her membership dwindled as her middle age spread increased. She died in debt and in poverty. After Jacob Frank's death, a letter circulated in 1799 from Frank's headquarters in Offenbach. It is known as the Red Epistle of 1799. It was written in red ink. The epistle exhorts members of the sect to embrace the holy religion of Edom, Christianity. Now, Edom is associated with the color red because the Hebrew word for red is Adam, A-D-O-M, which contains the same Hebrew letters but different vowels, hence the red ink. Scholem labels the epistle a mystical theory of revolution. This author prefers to call it the Red Kabbala. Scholem tells us that government officials intercepted copies of the epistle and they suspected its authors of being hidden revolutionaries, but for the wrong reason. The reason was that there were several references in the epistle to Jacob, which led them to surmise that they were in reality dealing with the Jacobins. An investigation was ordered on the spot. The authorities who conducted it in Frankfurt and Offenbach, however, did not delve beneath the surface of the affair and were quickly satisfied that it involved nothing more than an intrigue to swindle and extort money from ignorant Jews. On a deeper level, the authorities' suspicions were fully, if unwittingly, justified. Had they bothered to read and understand not just the debtor's notice of Frank's children in Offenbach, but also the prophecy of Isaiah that had been composed within the four walls of the court itself, they would have been amazed to discover how ardently these Frankist Jacobins yearned for the overthrow of the existing regime. The Jacobin leaders who were active in the French Revolution were anti-religious, but they could clearly be divided into two types, both of which manifested the anti-Semitism of which we spoke. One wanted to see the Jews obliterated and persecuted, and the other wanted to see the Jew emancipated and assimilated. The Frankists and the Illuminatist Jacobins aligned with Mirabeau, and they were anti-Semites, favoring the total assimilation of the Jews. Of course, the Jews were a minority among the Jacobins, and to call Jacobinism a Jewish plot would be just as ridiculous as calling the word communism Jewish-dominated, although both groups had their prominent Jewish revolutionaries. Among those revolutionaries who sought the physical destruction of the Jew, one could count Voltaire, the Astasian deputy Rubel, one named Lefar, Bishop of Nancy, and the Abbé Maury. Those who wished for the emancipation of the Jews on their spiritual destruction were Count Mirabeau, the Abbé Gregoire, Diderot, and Robespierre. Zelkind Auerwitz, Mendelssohn's Jacobin disciple, openly displayed such desires for Jews to assimilate so that he could be well characterized as a Jewish anti-Semite or a self-hating Jew. Thus, Herzberg informs us that he was a bitter enemy of the Talmud and the rabbinate. He asked that rabbis be denied any authority to discipline Jews via excommunication. Herzberg goes on to say that in his hatred of rabbis, Zelkind Auerwitz reached such fury that he even put into print accusations that must be called a piece of overt anti-Semitism. Commenting on the custom enjoined by the Talmud that Jewish dead are to be buried on the very day of death, Zelkind Auerwitz wrote that it is quite probable that the homicide custom was introduced by some rabbi who was a poisoner in order to hide his crime from the law. In 1789, there were approximately 40,000 Jews in France, 30,000 of whom lived in ghettos. During the Reign of Terror, all houses of worship were closed in accordance with Jacobin anti-religious policy. The churches and synagogues were reopened after Robespierre was guillotined on July 28, 1794, signifying the end of terror and the Jacobin power base. The Jews could now enjoy the full benefit of a vote taken on September 28, 1791, by the Commune before the National Assembly, in which 53 out of 60 districts in France voted in favor of granting all Jews of France complete civil rights on par with all citizens, which meant that the decision favored the spiritual anti-Semites for Jews to assimilate. What we are confronted with here is the legitimate desire for Jews to have their legal civil rights being exploited by radical revolutionaries. It is then no wonder that there were such phenomena in France as Jewish Jacobin lodges. For example, Hertzberg cites a Jewish Jacobin lodge in Bayonne, which he characterizes as less anti-religious than the usual run of Jacobins, including those in control of Bayonne itself. Hertzberg gives a comprehensive presentation with regard to the major personalities of the French Revolution and their attitude towards Jews. Voltaire was virulently anti-Semitic. Voltaire was prone to concocting plots against Jews. For example, he accused a prominent wealthy Jew, Solomon Levy, of spying for the Emperor of Austria. Voltaire stated, "A Jew belonging to no land other than the one where he makes his money. Can he not just as easily betray the king for the emperor as the emperor for the king?" Voltaire was prone to make disparaging remarks pertaining to Jews as being akin to barbarians, in addition to voicing his incisive criticism of the Bible, its Jewish background, and all religions, typically of Jacobin rhetoric. The Jacobins did not take any chance, though, in suppressing or censoring anti-Semitic rabble-rousing, for although the revolutionary left, represented primarily by the Commune of Paris, adopted the cause of the Jews, its leaders knew very well that this attitude was unpopular with the masses, which raises the question whether the revolutionary left had significant amounts of Jewish money behind it to dissuade itself from giving it into the masses. A circular letter issued by the Jacobins after the revolution makes mention that they were less concerned about the Jewish religious system than about what they called their criminal antipathy to all citizens who do not belong to their ridiculous cult. Another Jacobin outburst declared that Jews should give up their swindles and extortions and work with their hands in their workshops and fields. Hertzberg classifies this rhetoric as that of some of the extreme Jacobins of eastern France. Many scholars have noted that Karl Marx's anti-Semitic outlook bore a relationship to Voltaire's works. The point is made, for example, in a book entitled Anti-Semites in Modern France. A historian named Saberner has taken up the question of the anti-Semitic attitudes of the European left in the 19th century in a work entitled Western Socialism and the Jewish Question. However, he does fail to link the socialist outlook with Voltaire. Hertzberg, noting this, maintains that the subject needs further study. Whether the Frankists became Jacobins, reform or conservative movement leaders, or otherwise, one thing came down from generation to generation in their circles, and that was their profound hatred for Torah, true Judaism, the Talmud, and the rabbis, which unfortunately manifests itself to this very day among large segments of the leadership of conservative and reform movements throughout diaspora. These successors of the Frankists and the Haskalah were in no small way influenced by Frank's disciples, to whom we will now turn our attention. Chapter 11. The Frankist Elite.